Hello. Today we're going to start a look at the book of Daniel. Why are we looking at Daniel? Well, it's probably important for three different reasons. The first is that it has a heritage and history, particularly amongst Seventh-day Adventists. It's part of how we became to be, it's part of our identity. The second is that it's apocalyptic, and the third is that it deals with themes of exile. So what do I mean by this? What do I mean by apocalyptic? Well, I don't mean disaster, catastrophe, or the end of the world, as we often use the term. I mean it in the technical term. It means unveiled or revealed. In other words, it means what is going on behind the scenes. What's the cosmic reality? And what do we mean about living in exile? Well, it helps answer the question, how are we faithful in a foreign land? Do we assimilate? Do we keep separate? And that's our experience today. We're citizens of the heavenly kingdom, but we're living in this world. We're trying, as Jesus said, to be in the world, but not of the world. So those two main themes, the apocalyptic and living in exile, run all the way through the book of Daniel. It's about what God is doing and will do, and what we are doing. So it goes through the whole book, and the whole book, well, we're very familiar with the prophetic passages. These are the passages that show God at work in history. But there's also interspersed within it narratives, court tales of Daniel and his friends. And these show us how to live in exile. Today we're going to have a look at chapter 1. Now, I'm not promising to do a week by week, chapter by chapter study, but we'll set up a playlist and we'll come back to us every now and again and we'll build up a collection of sermons on Daniel. But today, let's start at the very beginning. Daniel chapter 1 is normally seen as a narrative or a court tale. It sets the scene for the whole book. It introduces the characters. It highlights his faith. But actually, this chapter is more than just that. This chapter actually highlights those two main themes that we see all the way through the book of Daniel. The apocalyptic, pulling back the curtain. God explains what really happens, and, spoiler alert, what will happen. And also that second theme, how to live in exile, what to compromise on, and more importantly, what to stand firm on. If you need to know what apocalyptic is all about, then the first two verses explain it. In the 3rd year of the reign of King Joachim of Judah, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came to Jerusalem and besieged it. Now this is how it appears to everyone. This is how you and I see things. But in apocalyptic literature, the curtain is pulled back and we see how things really are. That's in verse 2. But the Lord let King Joachim of Judah fall into his power, as well as some of the vessels of the house of God. These he brought to the land of Shinar, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his gods. Did you notice what really happened? God directed the story. The newspapers may say Jerusalem fell, the Babylonian chronicles may say Nebuchadnezzar won, but Daniel tells us God is sovereign. God is in control. This is why it's important to read and understand apocalyptic writing. It reminds us that what we see around us is not the full story. It reminds us that despite all that we see taking place in the world around us, God is in control. Like Jerusalem, our world may fall apart, our hope may fail, our future may look bleak. But God is in control. God is guiding our story, and God isn't finished yet. And there's something else. Did you notice it? Verse 2 focuses on God, the true God, and also the false Babylonian gods. And this is another aspect, an important aspect of apocalyptic writing. What takes place behind the scenes? It's what people don't realise. It's that there's a cosmic conflict taking place. There's a conflict between good and evil. There's a great controversy between God and the devil, and this earth is the battleground. We need to be aware of that, and we need to help the unsuspecting world around us glimpse behind the curtain and see this reality. The last verse of this first chapter of Daniel also tells us something really important about apocalyptic writing. And Daniel continued there until the first year of Cyrus. So what's important? Well, they include spoilers. In this first chapter, Nebuchadnezzar is the most powerful king in the world, and he hopes to reign for a long time and found a dynasty. But this verse puts pay to all of that. This verse shows us that not only is God sovereign and in control, he tells us what he's going to do. In other words, apocalyptic doesn't just pull back the curtain and show what God is doing now. It shows us what he's going to do in the future. This is important because when we see God predict, or prophesy, as we technically call it, something, and then it happens, it gives us confidence, and we know that God kept his word. And that tells us that God can be trusted to do the things he says he will. And that's the final aspect of apocalyptic writing. Now, it's not super clear here in this chapter, but we'll see it in more detail in later chapters in Daniel. And that's this: God is working towards a conclusion. Apocalyptic pulls back the curtain. It shows us what God is doing. But apocalyptic also unveils, reveals the future when it tells us what God is going to do. Apocalyptic tells us that God will win the great controversy, and as later chapters in Daniel explain, he will come back to this world, he will destroy sin, he will create a new world for his people to live with him in. So if we got all that from just 3 verses in this chapter, what do we get from the other 18? Well, actually, there's almost too much to include today. But this is a really well-known story, but maybe the lesson isn't quite what we thought it would be. Let's have a look. This story introduces us to a theme that we keep coming back to throughout the book of Daniel, and that's how to live in exile. This acknowledges the tension that followers of God, Christians, citizens of the kingdom of heaven, have always felt in their lives. How do you follow the principles of God and live according to his values in a world that at best ignores God's teachings, or at worst actively opposes his truth? Or as Jesus put it, how can we be in the world but not of the world? Now, I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel this tension in my life, and I'm sure you'll have struggled with it at some time or another. Now, down through the ages, when faced with this struggle, this tension, Christians have tended to make a choice between 2 options: assimilation or separation. Assimilation is where you downplay the differences. You make compromises, you try not to stand out, you settle into Babylonian exile. Separation is where you emphasize the differences. You try to stand out, you avoid contamination, you try to escape from Babylon. So which of these is the right choice? Is it always going to be the same one? Are there only 2 choices? Well, maybe the story of Daniel in Babylon, Daniel in exile, will help us learn where to draw the line. In Daniel 1, we discover that the Babylonians take some of the young leaders from Judah to try and assimilate them by training them to be officials. So how will Daniel and his friends allow this process to go? What will they compromise on? What will they stand firm on? One of the first things we notice about Daniel and his friends is that their names are changed. Daniel, by the way, his name means God is my judge. Hananiah's name means Yahweh, or the Lord, is gracious. Mishael means who is like God. And Azariah means Yahweh, or the Lord, has helped. All their names are connected and tied to the true God that they serve, that they follow, that they worship. The names change. Daniel becomes Belteshazzar, which means may Bel, or the god Marduk, protect his people. Hananiah becomes Shadrach, which is a bit unclear, but it probably means at the command of Aku, that's the moon god. Mishael becomes Meshach, and that probably means who is like Aku, the moon god again. Azariah becomes Abednego, which means servant of Nebo. Now Nebo was the patron god of scribes, literacy and wisdom, and the son of Marduk. As you can tell, all these names are connected with Babylonian gods. Now surely this would cause problems for these devout Hebrews. What about the first commandment? But we don't yet see them taking a stand. Have you wondered what the men were going to be taught? Well, they were going to be trained to be court officials, government administrators, civil servants, diplomats. Language, well, that means they would be taught Akkadian, Sumerian, Aramaic. Literature and wisdom, well, the phrase language and literature, or language and wisdom, is used elsewhere in Babylonian things to describe certain practices, and those are mathematics, astrology, interpretation of dreams, divination, omen interpretation. That's what they're going to be learning. They're going to be doing advanced academic study in all the kinds of things that God told his people not to do. Surely this was going to cause a problem for these devout Hebrews. What about all the prohibitions against these practices found in their scriptures? But we don't yet see them taking a stand. But the Babylonians haven't finished yet. There's still something else they do to change these Hebrews' identity. It's something that's easily overlooked or missed. Verse 3, Aspenaz, his title, depending on your translation, is palace master, court official. But it's literally chief eunuch. So, were Daniel and his friends made into eunuchs? Well, it's probable. The word here, saris, has come to mean trusted official or eunuch. But we know in the Middle East they're often the same people. But there's something interesting here. In Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah in Isaiah 33 speaks to Hezekiah, and he tells them what's going to happen to his descendants. It's a punishment for his actions. He says this to him: "Days are coming when all that is in your house and all which your ancestors have stored up until this day shall be carried into Babylon. Nothing shall be left, says the Lord. Some of your own sons who are born to you, they shall be taken away. They shall be eunuchs in the palace of Babylon." This was a prophecy, and Daniel 1 is the fulfillment. Babylon destroys Jerusalem, takes things away, takes people away, and makes them eunuchs. So why is this so bad? I mean, apart from the obvious physical reasons. Well, if we look at Hebrew society, we look at the Old Testament, we see that eunuchs weren't allowed to be included amongst God's people. They're literally missing from God's chosen, and they couldn't worship God. Now surely this is going to cause problems for these devout Hebrew boys. What about the prohibition against eunuchs being part of the people? But we don't see them take a stand yet. Well, so far it seems like there's more assimilation than separation. I mean, what's going on here? At the very least, they don't seem to think it threatens their covenantal relationship with God. But as we know, there's still one thing that's expected of the students that we haven't looked at yet. Now surely after all these other compromises, this one can't be too difficult either. The students are to be fed from the king's table. Now that sounds a lot more generous than my student maintenance grant. But it's now that Daniel and his colleagues take a stand. They refuse to eat. They make a test out of it. And ultimately, God vindicates them and their decision. But why is the line drawn here? What's so important about food? What defilement are they trying to avoid? Now, some people like to claim it was because of the health benefits of a vegetarian diet. They'll even argue that's why they did so well in the final exam. But I'm not so sure. Now, I'll agree, a plant-based diet can be one of the healthiest, and God does call us to respect our bodies and to honour Him by treating them well. But Daniel doesn't stay a vegetarian forever. In chapter 10, he talks about abstaining from meat for 3 weeks, implying that he normally ate it. So they probably didn't turn down the king's food because of veganuary. Another suggestion is that the palace food was either unclean or had been offered to idols. This may be true, but I'm not sure it would have made much of a real difference. Hosea chapter 9 implies that all Assyrian food is unclean, not just meat or ceremonial unclean food, but anything they prepare or produce. And that would have included their beans. And why worry about offering food to foreign gods and blessing foreign gods when their very names are prayers to foreign gods? They didn't object to that. So it doesn't seem as if that's a sufficient reason for them to turn down food and risk death when they hadn't done it before. Maybe it's not really about the food. The word here used to describe the king's food, it's a wonderful word, pat bag. It's used in one other place, and that's Daniel 10:26, where it says, "But they shall not succeed, for plot shall be devised against him by those that eat of royal portions, and they shall break him." It's the term that's used to describe those that are close to the king. It's those that are loyal to him. If you eat from the king's table, you're showing publicly your allegiance to the king. In 1 Samuel 20, when David is no longer loyal to Saul, that's made really apparent when he doesn't eat at the table during the feasts and Saul notices it and gets really angry. In 2 Samuel 9, Mephibosheth is invited to eat at the king's table. In other words, he's treated as one of the family. He renounces the family of Saul he used to belong with and now shows his allegiance to David. So this idea that eating at the king's table shows your undying, unswerving loyalty to the king. Now that seems a reason to turn down the king's food. Daniel draws the line at allegiance to the king. He'll have his name changed. He'll study divination and dream interpretation. He'll be castrated. He will serve in the Babylonian government. But he gives his allegiance to only one, the one true God. And if you have any doubts where this line is drawn, chapter 3, spoiler alert, chapter 3 will make it clear that allegiance to God and true worship, now that's the hill to die on. That's the line in the sand. So what does this mean for those of us trying to live our lives in this tension of exile? Of being in the world, but not of the world? Have we perhaps drawn the line in the wrong place? Have we become so frightened of assimilating that we become too separate? I mean, I wonder if sometimes our desire to be separate has led us to lose the opportunity that Daniel had to influence his society and the chance he had to share his faith in exile. See, Daniel 1 appears to tell us that our faith and our identity is not as easily compromised by Babylonian exile as some people think. It tells us that we shouldn't be frightened of living in exile. It tells us that if we keep our allegiance on God and worship Him only, He will keep us safe in Babylon. And in later chapters, we'll discover that He can even be used to convert Babylonians. I hope today that you'll have enjoyed this little look at the beginning of Daniel. I hope today that you'll have learnt that in the book of Daniel we see both God pulling back the curtains and showing what He is doing, but also lessons on how we can live in difficult times of exile. So I hope today that you will get a glimpse of a God who is at work behind the scenes, a God who is sovereign and who is bringing the world to his conclusion. I also hope that you'll see this God at work in your life as you faithfully follow him in this place of exile. May your allegiance be to God, and may he use you for his honour and his glory. May the God who reveals his work behind the scenes in the book of Daniel reveal himself to you today. May you be aware of his plans, his purpose, and his future for you. May the God who is at work in the world work in your life. May this God bring you to his conclusion, and may we see him face to face one day soon. Amen.